All right, hello, junior scientists. Welcome to the very last panel of our Path of the Paleontologist event, where we at the Alf Museum are helping all of you figure out your path of the paleontologist by talking to many different job classes. And now we are on to our Path of the Preparator. For rock and stone, the Preparator is patient and strong-willed to carefully remove matrix from bone. Are you willing to make rocks a part of your everyday life? Now we'll find out and ask our many amazing preparators on the panel today. So why don't we start off by introducing everybody? Jared, why don't you go first?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jared Hoyk. I am the preparator at the Raymond Alf Museum and also co-workers with Gabe here on the panel with us.
Thank you. Laura, how about you?
Hi, my name is Laura Tewksbury, and I am a senior preparator and science communications liaison at the Brea Tarpits here in the middle of Los Angeles, California.
Ooh, go Tarpits. Skye, introduce yourself.
Hi everybody, my name is Skye Walker and I am a fossil preparator here at the Auburn University Museum of Natural History, and I'm also a science communicator, so I do a lot of science communication online, mainly Instagram and Twitter. I graduated last year from Auburn University with my degree in geology, my bachelor's, and I'm planning on going to graduate school. Probably for science education or museum studies. Haven't quite decided which one there, but I am going. But it's nice to be here and be able to talk to you guys.
Awesome. Well, welcome, Skye. And last but certainly not least, Stephany, please introduce yourself.
Hi everybody, my name is Stephany Potze. I'm the lab manager at the Brea Tarpits, and I'm excited to share with you my experience of paleontology today.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here. So, preparation, being a preparator, removing matrix from bone. Not really a job description that people talk about when you're going into paleontology. For all of you, why don't we start by sharing your story of how you got into preparation? Jared, let's start with you again.
My story. I was one of those kids that always loved dinosaurs growing up. I always knew what I wanted to go to school for. I was lucky enough to have a family to support that and send me to Montana State. Soon after I graduated high school, I finished my degree in geology in 2012, and along the way, I kind of shifted gears a little bit. I loved paleo. I liked the idea of extinct animals and stuff, but what I really came to enjoy was the geology aspect of it all. And so when I graduated, the very next day I went to work as a geosteerer in North Dakota. So I worked on oil rigs about 3 years. And during that time, on and off, I applied to grad school programs within paleontology. I was feeling kind of picky about the type of advisors that I wanted to work with because I wanted it to have that geology spin to it and not just paleo. But during my time at Montana State and even working on oil rigs, I spent a lot of time in the lab at the Museum of the Rockies. When I was in there, I pretty much only volunteered cleaning fossils. And that's kind of where I got a lot of my experience as a preparator. In the summer, I was lucky enough to be invited back to do a ton of field work, both through Museum of the Rockies and Montana State University, and all sorts of different really cool, famous localities like Hell Creek and Egg Mountain. In 2015, I moved back to Southern California, where I'm originally from, to pursue that master's degree. And along the way, I met people like Gabe and Andy, and started to volunteer at the Raymond Alf Museum. And initially, I just was coming in a couple hours a week, cleaning some bones for fun. They did not have a preparator. It was just volunteers, and there weren't a lot of us. But pretty soon I was moved to part-time because I guess I was good enough to keep me around. And as I finished my master's degree in a couple years, moved to full-time. So I'm now the only a full-time preparator at the Raymond M Museum.
Cool. And I remember when Jared applied as a volunteer, and he's all the way my coworker now, so it's really, really cool that we all kind of started at the same time. And we're also, uh, Titans from Cast Fullerton. We're in the same lab. So there's a kind of a theme here with a lot of the people that are on in this panel today. Or Laura, how about you? What's your story?
Absolutely. Always fun to what do I pick and really summarize with? I always had a love for digging in the dirt and playing with old things, mostly because my grandparents helped raise me with my mom when I was really little. And I blame my grandfather as an archaeologist for really inspiring me to have that love of old things and digging in the dirt. And like many children, I loved paleontology, even beyond archaeology, because people are fascinating, but I wanted to learn about everything else as well. And so it was definitely one of those where I was very lucky, and I had a lot of opportunities to do a lot of preparing work. Even during when I was in high school, there was a local elementary school that had gotten a grant to work on preparing a fossil whale from a local construction site. And so we were able to finagle that I would get school credit for high school, and my parents would drive me across town multiple days a week to work with the paleontologist Greg Seymour there, both working on the fossil whale and also helping to design and teach curricula to the elementary school students. And then I went off to junior college, so it was a more fiscally available thing for me. And because I'm in Southern California, there's a lot of legislation that helps protect fossils from local construction sites. So both Saddleback and Irvine Valley community colleges both happened to have, at the time I was there, paleontology prep classes, where paleontologists would work with fossils from local construction sites and get to work on it with students. And that's where I was like, no, this is what I love doing. I kind of feel like Michelangelo, I know that there's something in there, I just have to take away everything that isn't that. And then I was able to continue that love, looking for other volunteer opportunities, and found several, but it wasn't until I started volunteering at the Brea Tarpits in 2006 that I was like, ooh, it's a little young. It's only tens of thousands of years old, but this is just so different, but also so relevant with what's going on and the species that are still outside today, that I was like, oh, I think I could stick around. So when a funding for a project from a local construction site where they found a lot of fossils at the under corner of our park, they were like, hey, this is a temporary position. It's only going to be 5 years, but do you want to work on these fossils? And I said, yes. And so that was 2008. It's been a little more than 5 years, but it's definitely been one of those where I started out as part-time and then helping to pay bills by still working at a Baskin Robbins and that sort of thing. And in the very beginning, my parents driving me up to LA from Orange County every couple of days, so thank them for that. But then it wasn't until I was able to get a full-time and a lot more access that now I'm just a full-time staff member working on that same project, as we have been for many years and probably will be for many more years in the future.
Awesome. I always love hearing more stories of the local paleontologists, Skye, what about you? How did you get into the world of preparation?
Well, my story is a bit unremarkable when it comes to, history of paleontologists, but, as a little girl, I loved dinosaurs. It's the story you hear all over the place. Oh, I've loved dinosaurs since I was a kid, But it's true. I played with dinosaur toys, and I watched Land Before Time, Jurassic Park, things like that. And some of my earliest memories are of me following my family around, look at this dinosaur I learned about today. And so that continued on through my whole childhood. And then, unfortunately, I got older, and I was actually steered away from paleontology. I was told that, oh, they found all the dinosaurs already. Oh, there's no jobs in that. You can't do that. What kind of money are you going to make with that? And so, of course, me being very young and naive, I listened to them. And then I got to college, and you're never going to believe this, but I got a theater scholarship to a community college. And that was my life for 2 years. And then after that, I just realized I didn't want to do that, and I was struggling to find something that I was really passionate about. So I went all over the map. I even considered being a psychologist. I considered being a nurse. I just kind of went all over the place. And then I was reminded that I love dinosaurs. I should really get back into that. And so I looked all around and I learned that there was a really good geology program here at Auburn University. And I applied almost immediately. I got in, thank goodness. And so I got my bachelor's here. And then pretty soon on into my undergrad, I learned that the university had a museum here. And I thought, okay, well, I need to go see this. I need to go see like what they have, like see what's going on there. And so I took a tour and immediately fell in love with it. And I saw a sign saying that they needed volunteers. And so I talked to somebody that worked here and I said, hey, how do I start volunteering? And a long process later, here I am as a fossil prep here. And I've been here for about 4 years now. So I've been here a while. And so fossil prep, it wasn't really something that I always thought I would get into, but it really has been my gateway to paleontology. And because I do prep, it's opened so many more doors for me to teach and do field work, and I love it here.
That's awesome. That's an amazing story. You found your way back to your first love, so I think that's a fantastic story. Stephany, how about you? How did you make your way into the world of paleontological preparation?
Yes, it can be
It's been a long day.
So when I was young, I was always interested in archaeology and also forensic anthropology. And when I finished high school, instead of taking a gap year like most of my friends who went abroad and spent a year just hanging out in Europe, I decided to go and volunteer at a museum to get a better understanding of what exactly archaeology involves. And the only program that was available at the local museum where I lived in Pretoria in South Africa was the paleontology department. And so I went and volunteered there and then was completely sucked into the vortex of paleontology. I was just amazed. I was working in a department that had postdoc researchers from all over the world studying all different kinds of things, from microfossils to frogs to just focusing on the tooth development in a certain species of animal. And I couldn't believe that this field could go so in depth and become so specialized. And then I enrolled for a double major in anthropology and archaeology, graduated and was employed at that museum as a preparator. Eventually, I was promoted to be the collections manager there, did a lot of field work with some international teams from University of Michigan, as well as from the Center of National Scientific Research in Paris, France. We had big collaborative projects there. But one thing I realized as a collections manager, as wonderful as it was to work with the collections and really get to know it, the one thing I missed a lot was working and spending quality time with the fossils and actually, really handling fossils more than working on a computer. And when the position for lab manager opened up here at Rancho Brea, I thought, I think I want to do that. So I applied for the job and I was fortunate enough to be hired and then moved over with my family and our cat in 2016 from halfway across the world. And I've been here ever since.
That's awesome. Your passions for paleontology took you across the world. What a cool way of getting to a really cool place like the Tarpits also.
Yes.
So let's kind of talk about what is paleontological preparation. Some people might think it's you sitting behind a fishbowl with like a brush and a tooth, like picking away. Some people think it's with a jackhammer. Some people might think it's just you using a brush and wiping away sand, because that's so easy. That's exactly how that works. So for all of you, why don't you talk a little bit about what your job is as a preparator and kind of what your average day looks like, I guess. Anybody want to start?
I can hop in first. You're not wrong. It's, we spend a lot of time just cleaning fossils. I do work in a fishbowl lab. Haven't seen anyone outside the fishbowl for over a year, but it still counts as a fishbowl. But you mentioned jackhammers, or if you're cleaning off fossils with brushes, and it's really all of it. My job is to approach each different specimen as they come into the lab, and every single one is going to have some sort of different technique that's needed to get it back out the door. Most of my day is spent in the lab working hands-on with these fossils, but a lot of times I'm also taking photographs of these things and documenting what's happening to the specimen, working closely with Gabe and with Bailey and with Andy, and making sure these things are being taken care of, cataloging all that information, making sure it's available, cleaning up other people's mistakes from the past. A lot of times, I'm sure everyone here would agree that, our institutions are typically old and things were not always done to best practices for many different reasons, but regardless, we need to fix them. And so I would say that most of my work when it comes to prep is split between the cool new things that come in that we collect in the summers and the cool old things that have kind of been neglected over the years.
Well, I'll hop in next then. So it was one of those things where, so both Stephany and I work at the same institution as, she's a lab manager and I'm a preparator, but the preparation work that we do is very different. I work mostly outside, and so I'm kind of some of the earlier stages before her work. So a lot of the original work that I'm doing is actually doing the original release of the fossils from the sediments. And then just to be clear, even though I work at the Tarpits, they're technically asphaltic seeps, and the overwhelming majority of the material that I dig through are sands and gravels and silts and clays. So I dig mostly through dirt. It's just sticky dirt, but it's like 10% of it. It's just enough to hold it together and make everything messy and protect the fossils. So the most common tools that I use around fossils are things like dental picks, just kind of slowly, carefully untangling things. One of the reasons I have to use such a fine tool, even at that stage, is that we're ridiculously spoiled and we have a lot of fossils. And our fossils are mostly non-permineralized, so a lot of them are still the original bone material, which also means they're both as strong and as fragile as bone. And very often, like especially the project I've been working on lately, I have a pile of mostly sticks and bird legs, and there's some coyote and saber cat and badger and that sort of thing, but they're so tangled up with each other that I have to kind of like figure out in 3D, like, okay, I have to get that out before I can get that out, before I can get that out, and like pick which angle I can kind of Pac-Man my way back from. And in areas that aren't as many fossils, you'll see me using more like hammers and chisels and that sort of thing. But then even all of that material that I didn't see obvious fossils in will still go through several other coworkers and steps to double check for tiny fossils I might have missed, some of those microfossils. But I tend to just do the original releases, make sure all of that field data is with all of those fossils, anything special notes about it, like if we did have to use some kind of glue or consolidant on maybe a very weak area, make sure that all of those notes are there so that when Stephany gets it inside the lab later, she's not like, what happened to this? So it's all about teamwork and communication, because also between me working on it and her working on it could be literally years depending on whatever the current research projects are. And that's why notes are important. Even if you're like, oh, well, this is going to be obvious, of course we'll remember. I've been here for 15 years already. I acknowledge that I don't remember everything anymore. I remember more than I expected I would, but notes are important. Because also, like, if I win the lottery tomorrow and I go on a vacation, they also then still need to know what happened to all of these fossils. So it's not just the actual excavation, it's trying to take as good of notes as possible, because what we do is destructive. And, we can't undo what we've done. And we have to make sure that all of that is recorded to the best of our abilities. I look at the me of 100 years ago and throw a lot of shade, but at the same time, I know that the me of 100 years from now will look at me the same way. So I just do my best to make the me of 100 years from now hate me as little as possible.
Okay, I guess I'll go next. So it's not too much different from what Laura was saying. So I kind of have a two-in-one job a little bit. So I do mostly fossil prep, but I'm also a collections assistant. So a good bit of my job is, taking care of the collection and making sure everything's where it's supposed to be. And pretty recently, we actually had to move our paleontology collection because it was combined with our herpetology collection for some reason. And of course, going through collections like that after being together for so long, you find, past mistakes. And, I'm over here like, why is this mosasaur vertebrate in here with these turtle shell fragments? It just doesn't make sense. They're not even from the same locality. And so we have to fix things like that, even if it's just little things, like a shark tooth here or, a turtle fragment there. So it's all about making things easier for the people after you. And in case, someone comes along and they're like, hey, I'm doing research on this thing. Can you point me in the direction of this specimen? And you're like, yeah, I know exactly where that is. And so with fossil prep, a lot of the things that I use are hand tools. We're not spoiled with an air scribe or anything fancy like that. So a lot of our work is done by hand. So with brushes and hammers, chisels, even like toothbrushes, dental picks, things like that, very delicate things. And the project that I'm working on right now is actually a turtle from New Mexico. And the sediment is very soft, very, very clay-ish. And so the turtle itself is very fragile. It's very frustrating at times, so the work can be very tedious. And if you're not careful, these little bits will crumble off and you just lose it, or you can lose a whole section itself if you're not careful. But in the end, you get to slowly unearth this thing that nobody has laid eyes on in millions of years, and you just kind of slowly see it come out of the sediment, and it's magical. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm the one doing this. Like, I'm uncovering this. It's just, wow, it's awesome.
All right, so for the Brea Tarpits Fossil Lab, it's a little different to most prep laboratories because it's predominantly a chemical preparation laboratory. So we need to use different kinds of solvents that can break down oil, which is basically the main component of the asphalt that we find our fossils preserved in. And so we have to use these solvents to reliquefy the asphalt or break down the oil component. So as Laura mentioned earlier, is that we actually have a lot of sediment that coats our fossils, and the asphalt only makes up an extremely tiny percentage of the makeup, but it is the main preserving agent that we have. And there's often a misconception that we pull bones out of dripping asphalt and it's just oozing and gooing and everywhere, but actually that is not the case. When Laura excavates it and she brings it into the lab, like she said, it can stay in the shelf or in a box in the lab for many, many years before it gets prepared. And over that time, and even before that, what happens is as the asphalt is exposed to the atmosphere, it starts to oxidize or harden over time. And so in the lab, we soften that up again by breaking down the oil component and reliquefying that asphalt with different kinds of solvents. It's a very gradual and meticulous work that we do because it's also important for us to ensure that we do not cause any superficial damages that can be misinterpreted as something else by scientists. And we also want to make sure that when we are removing these layers of asphalt and the fine grains of sediment coating the fossil, that we do that in a way where we can also notice if we see something that is unique or special and bring that to the attention of the collections team, or either document it in our preparation work records. Then the other thing that we do is, Laura was also talking about all these tiny little microfossils that we can find. We spend a lot of time, half our lab is actually dedicated to sorting through these sediments, looking for all the different kinds of microfossils. And Rancho La Brea is extremely unique with the amount of microfossils that we have, because asphalt is such an excellent preserving agent, and it's almost like a sticky fly trap paper. Everything that comes in contact with it gets preserved. So we have microfossils that range from freshwater shells to beetle wing coverings to rodent cheek teeth and seed pods and leaf fragments. So we really have a wonderful abundance and a representation of an ancient ecosystem in our microfossil component. And then we also spend a lot of time doing conservation work. So we are looking at different kinds of adhesives that we use, adhesives that we used in the past that are proving not to be stable in the long term, how we can remove them. We're also taking notes of all these things. And we're just trying to constantly improve the practices in the lab to be one of the best asphalt preparation laboratories in the world. We are the largest, so we have a lot of other asphalt deposit sites in other parts of the world that come to us with questions. And so we want to make sure that we can give answers that are scientifically accurate for the field of paleo preparation. And so what we are doing now as well is we're investigating different kinds of solvents to try and see if we can phase out the existing solvent that we are using, just because we are also being more conscious and aware of not only the safety for the fossil, but also the safety of the preparators. And then another thing that we're trying to do at the Rancho Brea lab is we're trying to convert it into what's known as a green lab. We phased out all single-use plastics. We're trying to be as eco-conscious and friendly as possible. So we've replaced a lot of our tools with bamboo, and we hardly have any single-use plastic in the lab anymore. We also have a great program where we recycle our nitrile gloves that we use, and hazmat all our chemicals. So we are trying to do a lot of things in that lab, not just preparation. And when now that everything is opening up in Southern California, in Los Angeles County again, we hope to get our volunteers back at some point. And that's also a big part of our job, is we spend a lot of time training and working with our volunteers. Before we closed for the pandemic, the Rancho Brea lab was open 7 days a week, and we had over 57 volunteers rotating through that space on a daily basis. So it's also a place where we can train and educate people that are interested in this field through the volunteer program on exactly what is required in the field of asphalt preparation in our laboratory.
That's so cool. I love that. The Tarpits is kind of like my home museum. When I'm from Los Angeles. That's the place my parents would take me. Really helped inspire my love of paleontology. So getting to hear all that, like the little kid in me is just like, that's so awesome. I love it. Kind of talking about all these awesome skills you all talked about, whether using certain tools, learning about chemistry, glues. I'm going to tell everyone now, glue is very important when you're in paleontology. Where does one get that training? Is it in school? Is it on the job? Like you said, you have a volunteer program. How does somebody just get into that?
So from my side, it was all through being a volunteer. And that's why we put such an emphasis on training our volunteers in all these skill sets. In South Africa, paleontology preparation is not offered as any kind of coursework at the university level, which personally I think is a shame, because we often get people that graduate with PhDs that don't even know the beginnings of how to remove matrix coating a fossil. And I think it's extremely important for people to understand that, because whatever happens out in excavations or out in the lab kind of dictates what that fossil can use be in the future. If something goes wrong, you can actually lose the scientific value associated with that specimen. And so because it is the starting block of the race, basically, it's a very important area. And so I learned it through being a volunteer, and that's why we put such an emphasis on it in the lab as well, to ensure that our volunteers can get that as a training opportunity as well when they are in that space with us.
And so I touched upon this briefly in my introduction, but so I did happen to have opportunities in school to do prep work, and worked with amazing scientists. Some of them who specialize in prep work, and some of them who didn't, but knew enough to help kind of foster a lot of that. But again, it wasn't until I came to the tar pits and really started volunteering that I learned a lot of the things that are most useful for the work that I do. And most of my coworkers were volunteers of mine that I trained. And it's one of those things where people are like, oh, you have such a great relationship with your volunteers. And I was like, well, yes, I started out as one. And I never know who's going to just end up being my coworker or my supervisor someday. And also, I want them, if they're here, I want to make sure to give them as many useful skills as possible, because you never know where a lot of those skills are necessarily going to help you. And so it's one of those things that some of them have paleontology or other related ology backgrounds, but I also have crossing guards and comedians and people that help do the fine soldering to repair medical devices and are like, I'm good with, fine eye-hand coordination. And I was like, come on in, I can teach you what you need to know for this. And the amount of people who then maybe did shift more into paleontology, or he even just said, oh, I get to still do these things that I was always interested in doing and still have this other job that pays my bills, and manage to still do both things. That for me, volunteering was very, very important. And so fostering that opportunity is something that I would love to get back to when we can do it safely and responsibly.
Yeah, so with my experience learning how to fossil prep, a lot of it has been teaching myself. With my institution, geology and just, geosciences altogether are not the most popular thing around here. They're not the most important thing. So really, for a long time, I was the only volunteer. And so it was me and the curator and maybe one other woman. She didn't even really call herself a volunteer, but she had been coming and helping out with the collection for a long time. And so I learned, how to be a collections assistant from her. And so then I just kind of took over for her. But it was my curator, and he said, well, we've got all these jackets need to be opened up, and some of them are from the 80s, and, well, you want to help me open them up? And I said, sure. And so it was a lot of trial and error. Basically he would bust open the jackets for me, and he kind of taught me the basics. And so I just would sit down and just go to work, and we started off with the easy stuff. So I had this big chunk of chalk just full of shark vertebrae and little tiny bone pieces, and so I couldn't mess that up, right? So again, lots of trial and error, and then 4 years later, I'm working on mosasaurs and turtles and things like that, and a lot of times with my fingers glued together. So it really is a process, and it takes patience and time and the willingness to learn. And I find it really interesting how a lot of people have learned in so many different ways, and some people are actually certified in this thing and they've had actual training, and then there are people like me who just kind of had to keep on trucking and keep on trying until I'm where I'm at today. So that's pretty cool to see the range of education with this field.
I would say my experience has probably been most similar to Skye's, in that I volunteered at the Museum of the Rockies, and two individuals who taught me almost everything I know are now retiring. And Stephany, it's funny that you mentioned PhDs not knowing how to clean a fossil, because in my undergrad I had to take Paleontological lab techniques, learn how to prep. It was an official course taught by a PhD student. And I said, do I really have to take this? Because I've been here for like 3 years. And of course I did. And it was like that scene of Parks and Rec when Ron Swanson walks into the Home Depot and the worker says, can I help you? And he says, I know more than you. And I kind of wish that it was taught more, because it wasn't taught very well for me. But like Skye said too, it's a ton of trial and error. I got pretty good at cleaning Hell Creek specimens. When I came to the Alf Museum, it was all Kyparowitz, and the matrix is an entirely different beast. The things that I cleaned 4 or 5 years ago are not as good as how I would do them now. And every one of these specimens is going to be unique. It's going to have its own challenges, and it's just about practicing. And as I'm sure we'll talk about later, it's also about networking and talking to people and asking questions.
Definitely. Kind of on that note, let's talk about like a career, getting a job in preparation, what are like some of the realities you want people to understand if they want to pursue this career, right? Things about like, again, pay, advocating for yourself, applying for a job, even how to find job openings. Even anybody want to share something that they think people need to really understand if they want to go into preparation?
Go ahead. I think that that's part of the niche that volunteering can fill. Is some of that is networking, and because every once in a while, like even local, monitoring companies that are the companies that help go before, during, and after big excavation equipment at construction sites to look for fossils and that sort of thing. I definitely will get like messages from them being like, hey, we're hiring. And, we have a little message board that I can like be like, hey, here are some jobs in the area. And they involve a lot of driving and a varied skill set. But, those are some of the resources that we have. I know we have a lot of online resources now. Just the message board ability of social media and websites has really, I've just like seen it over this last 10 years where you can just like actually like type in like, I'm looking for this particular type of thing, and how many people can like help support you in finding those things, because it's one of those things where sometimes there's lots of jobs available and sometimes there's not. And there are so many things that go into it. For me and a lot of people at my particular stepping away from college time, jobs were pretty scarce. And it fluctuates with things like depending on what the housing market is doing, because that impacts how much construction is happening, impacts how many jobs there are in the area. So I think Wall Street can influence paleontology in such a way that I never really thought about ahead of time. And so it's one of those things where it's easy to be discouraged if you happen to be trying to find that job in a time that there just doesn't happen to be one. And so it's definitely one of those things where just encouraging people to, like, if this is something that you love doing, that you're good at, I encourage them to continue trying to find those. Maybe you take other jobs, you work at a PetSmart or you work at a Baskin Robbins for a while, helping to pay your bills while you wait to try to find some of these opportunities. But just knowing that it isn't your fault always. Sometimes the jobs just aren't there. I definitely have a lot of friends that are just like, I did all of this work and there's no jobs. And I was like, that's not always your fault. Sometimes it's just bad luck. And I know that it's easy to get discouraged. And I have so many friends that left the field because they were like, there's no jobs. And then, a couple years later, they show back up again. I was like, oh, lovely to see you. I'm glad you came back. So it's definitely one of those that I would say the perseverance and patience and acknowledging that sometimes it's going to work and sometimes it isn't. And it's not always your fault. But that's why volunteering can be helpful, to get that networking, that ear to the ground, like, hey, where are the jobs? And I've talked a lot. Sorry, please, someone else.
Yes, volunteer. I walked into the Alf Museum and I said, hey, I clean fossils at Museum of the Rockies and I was pretty good at it. Do you want my references? And then I was hired part-time a few months later. And it's only because I knew what I was doing. Only because of those dozens, hundreds of hours in the basement of MOR. And I wouldn't have been able to do it otherwise. So networking is super important. And the grim reality is that there's only so many institutions and only so many institutions that need a preparator. And it can be hard to get into that. So not only networking and volunteering, but making sure you're honestly putting in more work than people around you sometimes might be necessary. But let your work stand for itself, have good work ethic, network.
Yeah, you can ask any paleontologist, any in the world, I don't care which one you talk to, you will never find one that says that they got into paleontology for the money. Least of all, fossil prep. But the reason that people get into these things is because they love them. And it's like the others have said, it's perseverance, hard work, networking, it's so much more work than people realize. And that's pretty much how I ended up where I am now. That's how Fossil Prep was my gateway into paleontology, because I was a volunteer for so long, and frankly still kind of am. And so it's really not a job that stops. And, once you're a student, of course you have to put the work in to make good grades and, be nice to everybody, because, you never know who you're going to work with one day. But networking is probably the most important thing that I could throw out there, because you never know who you're going to get introduced to. And that person that you meet just by random happenstance could open a door for you tomorrow, next week, a few years from now, and you never would have known that something like that could have happened. So it's really important. And not even really okay, it does help, to look on things like LinkedIn and Indeed, and, just ask around hey, do you know of any jobs in this field right now? But yes, networking, hard work, just keeping an ear out, and just don't lose hope, because you never know what could be right around the corner waiting for you.
Yes, I'm going to add on to the networking. There's some great sites on Facebook as well. We've got the Association for Materials and Methods in Paleontology, which is just a phenomenal platform for anyone that's interested in this. It's a great opportunity to see who is there, what's happening. People reach out with questions they might have or uncertainties, because it's a learning experience in this field, because you're expected to be able to see in the past and look into the future with the work that you do in the lab. And so having access to that network is vital. It's vital not only if you're interested in finding a position in this field, but also even while you are in the field, just to keep learning, keep trying to get better at what you are doing, and networking with those that do the same thing as you do and have the same struggles and the same headaches as well. And then again, like everyone else said, I think most of the people I know that work in paleontology, collections managers, excavators, preparators, all started as, or mainly started as, volunteers. It gave them the opportunity to get an insight of what exactly the field requires, what exactly that job requires. Is it really something you want to do? Because it is not the same as a curator or a researcher at a university. It's your research and your dedication becomes much more about understanding your deposit than understanding a specific animal and its evolution. That you've got to have that knowledge as well, but it becomes very more specific in preparation. And so my advice just to anyone is go onto Facebook groups that have things to do with paleontology. AMP's a great starting block for that. And then try and volunteer. Volunteer at any of your local universities or your local museums. Get your foot in the door. See if it's something you're really interested in. And that way you will also become more aware of what's happening, because you'll be surrounded by people that do that for a living. And then, yes, financially wise, it gives you a lot of job satisfaction. I'm happy every morning going to work and hanging out with the saber-toothed cats and the direwolves at the Brea Tarpits. And for me, that is as important as the paycheck at the end of the day as well.
Thank you all so much for those great answers. I'm going to add a little bit more of a promotional thing. Check out the Paleontology Education Facebook group as well. There is a great one that you can connect with paleontologists and educators and learn about different fields. Again, the My Fossil Project is a wonderful resource to use online, connect with folks, and just go walk into your local museum sometimes and just ask. I had asked if I could volunteer at the Tarpits once. I was a bit too young, so I can understand why that didn't go through. But, Jared walked into the Alf Museum. Skye got her started. So just ask. It doesn't hurt. The worst they'll do is say no, but there are tons of other places out there you can, get your feet wet with paleontology. Is that the expression? Get your feet wet? Okay, whatever. Moving on. It is now time for question and answers. We've got a lot of great questions from the audience. So starting off with, I gotta scroll all the way back up. This one comes from Jared McGowan, who is asking, when repairing a new specimen, how often might you discover new parts of species anatomy that either was missed or missing from earlier specimens, i.e. like display structures or muscle scars?
Pretty common. The more you work within a single locality or a quarry or formation or a species, the more you get really familiar with them, to the point where I've probably prepped several dozen hadrosaur ribs from a single quarry. And in fact, what I'm working on now is another one of those ribs. And I popped off a chunk of matrix one day and I instantly recognized something that wasn't normal. It was just the smallest little groove, and it turned out to be most likely a tooth mark, which had never been found in this quarry before. We've worked it for 15 years, and it's only because you have that trained eye. But yeah, you find a lot of interesting things like that, and it's kind of like when Dr. Farkey was talking about working with an artist in one of our earlier sessions today. It's just having that different eye, and it can be really useful to have multiple types of people looking at something like this.
Anyone else?
At the Brea Tarpits, we don't necessarily maybe always find new things like new tooth marks or stuff, but sometimes we do find bits and pieces belonging to the same bone that return to the lab at a later stage. It might have been catalogued or accessioned. Like we were discussing earlier at Rancho La Brea, things sometimes sit on a shelf for a while between excavations and preparation. And so we do have times where things come in from the collection and a match has been made. And so we do some conservation work on trying to rebuild or conserve that specimen in its entirety as it is found.
And I'm going to take a moment to plug really fast. We just had a paper that came out last year that actually talked about a whole new type of fossil that we never recorded yet at the Tarpits, which are coprolites, so fossil poop. And these ones are actually little neotoma, little pack rat poops that are basically little masses of plants, and plants preserve very well at our deposits anyway. So it makes sense, but they just never been recorded before. And so even though we'd found the bones of these animals for, over 100 years, it wasn't until just recently that we actually identified other fossils from their bodies. So that was one of those things that, again, like, we've been digging here for over 100 years, and there's still new stories to tell.
Yeah, very, well, kind of similar to that. I don't know. I'm just going to throw it in anyway. So it's not necessarily like a new species or like nothing really cool like bite marks or anything like that. But we have this site down here about an hour away, and it's famous for marine invertebrates. And so that's mainly what we go down there for. And so I remember one day we had, packed up for the day, and a couple weeks later, I was kind of looking through the box with my mentor, and we noticed this little bit of bone that we didn't know was there before. We had accidentally collected it. And so it was this, it was a mosasaur vertebra. And we were like, wait, there was a mosasaur there? And so obviously, we had to send a team back there to go collect the rest of it. And sadly, it wasn't like a whole mosasaur down there, but still, like, we had accidentally found a little piece of a mosasaur that nobody had found yet. So that's pretty cool. So stuff like that does happen.
How fun. Just, that's a kind of a cool surprise, right? Either little tiny rat poops or a mosasaur. That's just preparation for you, huh? Let's see. The next question is a combination from two different questions. This is from T. Gordon and Jurassic Ash. So the question is how often do you rely on your knowledge of osteology while preparing a specimen? And do you think skills like pathology, osteology, and anatomical examination apply to preparation?
I'm going to go ahead and dive in because I feel an emphatic yes to all of that. For me, especially, because I'm working with things that are so very tangled up, at least in my opinion, I have to have a good working understanding. You know, if I just see a bump, I need to know, okay, that's the right pre-zygapophysis off of a saber-toothed cat thoracic vertebra. The rest of that bone should have this shape and extend this far in this direction and all these kinds of things. Because if I'm trying to get it untangled from all of these other fossils, I don't want to damage things. So having that, being able to visualize where it should be in three-dimensional space as I'm excavating helps me to reduce damage and untangle those fossils. And also recognize when there is something that's odd, where every once in a while I'll come across something and be like, oh, wait, why is that, you know, that third trochanter, you know, it's such an odd shape, the little trochlea on the bottom of that tarsus, the little songbird. And then, you know, I'll mention it in passing, you know, like, oh, we have a bird researcher that happens to be here right now. You know, hey, by the way, and they're like, oh, that's woodpecker. That's literally what I'm here to find. Let's go talk to the lab and see if they can push that specimen through. So having that working knowledge of what I should expect to see helps me reduce damage and also help impact, you know, furthering research goals. So yes to all of that.
Yeah, and kind of adding on to what Laura said, you know, just having like that background knowledge at your disposal. Really, any kind of anatomical knowledge like that, especially with classes that I took, like comparative anatomy, are so important, because one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever been given about paleontology and biology, really, is how can you expect to understand the life of yesterday when you don't understand the life of today? So it's really important, like I said, to have that background knowledge, and like Laura said, to know kind of what you're looking for, what's supposed to be there. And so if you see something and you have that knowledge at your disposal, you know, hey, that's not supposed to be there. What is that? And then also knowing like was this shell just broken in half, or was it bitten in half? So kind of knowing the difference will really save you in the long run. So yes, as many, you know, comparative anatomy classes, or just really anatomical classes, anything like that, are invaluable with fossil prep especially.
Yes, and I'm going to chime in as well. So our conservation station in the lab is where we do a lot of the adhesive and repair work, and it's probably our most popular station. We also call it our arts and crafts station, because the reality is most of the time fossils are not beautifully and perfectly preserved. So you do spend quite a lot of time having to reconstruct bits of bone together to build the specimen that you're working on. We use a lot of different materials to assist in doing that, but to have a basic foundation understanding of osteology is vital for that kind of work as well in the laboratory, because you need to know how to rebuild the bone. You need to have an understanding of the form and shape of that bone. Otherwise, you can manipulate a straight bone to be a curvy bone if you don't understand what you're looking at. The reality is also you're not expected to know what every single skeleton of every single animal under the sun looks like. So we have a fantastic thing in our lab as well that's called a comparative collection. And what it is, it's basically like a bone library. We have drawers of all the skeletal elements of specific species that we find at Rancho La Brea, and we can go in those drawers and we can pull them out and we can use them side by side, almost like you would have a box lid for a puzzle next to you while you're building the puzzle. It serves the same purpose when we are working with these bones that are really quite poorly preserved through fossilization and having to rebuild them.
Awesome. Here's another question that I'm combining, because everyone's kind of got the same question from our chat. This one's from our good friend Mermaid Labs, Allison Park, Nadia, who's greetings from Malaysia. They're all pretty much asking, how common is it that museums have volunteers work in preparation? And if you're going into preparation, do you need a degree?
I'm going to hop in here first again. That's all right. So for us, at least, volunteering is incredibly common, frankly, because there is a lot of work to do. And resources are finite. And if we are able to use volunteers to support and supplement our staffing, that's something that is very common, at least in Southern California. Optimally, like others were talking about, optimally, we'd love to pay everyone, but especially, given, strict resources, and with us where we have so many fossils, it's prohibitive to try to have everyone be staff. And it does, and again, we at least give them opportunities to learn things that they can hopefully get paid positions with. And then the second portion of the question was something that I also wanted to talk about, and it just left my brain. What's the second portion of the question?
Do you need a degree to work in preparation?
And that's why I wanted to jump in, because as it happened, I finished some of my associate's degrees in a variety of things, from anthropology to American Sign Language interpreting. But I actually was in the middle of my bachelor's, so still on my upward trend for all of my future degrees, when the job opportunity showed up at the Tarpits. And they were like, again, this is a 5-year project, do you want it? And I said, yes. And so I actually paused my schooling for 5 years starting in 2008. And it was one of those that, I still go back and take as many classes as I can here and there. I do intend to finish my bachelor's, but at this point, I currently don't even have a bachelor's degree. And it's definitely something that hands-on training has replaced a lot of that very specialized knowledge. But it still would be helpful for me going to other places and starting fresh in new localities if I had a little bit more school under my belt. But it's not required.
On the note about volunteers, it kind of depends on the size of the institution too. The Alf Museum in my prep lab, we have 4 or 5 volunteers, maybe totaling 40 hours a week, 48 hours a week. And that's just because we're a smaller institution. We don't have this huge backlog of stuff like the Tarpits does. And I know some institutions will actively recruit volunteers, and we don't. And the thing is, if you just go up to a museum and ask to volunteer, they'll probably say yes. Like, we don't actively recruit, but we're not going to turn anyone down. So it never hurts to ask.
Yes, and for the fossil lab, the volunteer program is like Laura said, we have such an abundance of material. The Tarpits is extremely unique in that its excavation site is on the same site as the lab and the museum, and it's a year-round operation. So like most institutions, there's a season where you go out to excavate. Here, things come through every day. So with our staff contingent to keep up with that amount of work coming in, we do rely heavily on volunteers to help us just to prevent creating a backlog. And then the other thing is also the relationship with our volunteer program is almost like mutual relationship in which we benefit from having the extra hands help us push through the fossils, but it's also where the volunteers get an opportunity to be educated in the specific skill set. And because of that, we've actually opened up the volunteer application pool for the fossil lab. For once you're 16 years old, you can start applying to see if you want to be a volunteer. Our program is still on hiatus. I'm not sure when it will open, but it's also just to give people an idea of what the field involves, maybe before they start making choices for college degrees, just as a way to get in there. And yeah, like I said, it's a mutual relationship in which the museum benefits from the extra hands helping out, and the volunteers benefit from the skill sets they develop.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, for a really long time, I was the only volunteer that, our collection had. A lot of the other volunteers were in herpetology and just all the other collections, really. So for some reason, paleontology was kind of scarce. And we had a really small geosciences program as well, and I'm pretty sure we still do. So it's a little different around here. Volunteers are a little in short supply. But I want to say it's because a lot of people just don't know that the opportunities to volunteer are out there. And so that's why, I try to make it known that volunteering is an option. And it's a really good way, like Stephany said before, to get your foot in the door. And it's a great resource for students, and they don't even know. But the second question is, it's kind of an important topic to me because I grew up and I got into school and I was thinking, all right, school is my only option. That's the only way I can ever succeed in life, because that's something that's drilled into our brains our entire lives, and that's just not true. Academia, getting your degrees and your your masters, your PhD, all of that is amazing, but it's not the only way in. And that's one thing that I want to dispel about paleontology, is that you don't have to be a genius, or you don't have to be a doctor or anything like that. You can just do it, and there are so many different ways to, like with volunteering. And you don't even necessarily have to have a degree for fossil prep. I mean, I was fossil prepping while I was getting my degree, and nobody asked me if I had a degree in it. And of course, you can go the extra mile and get certified and things like that, but it's not 100% required. And it really just depends on where you are and just kind of what you want to do and how far you want to go with it.
All excellent answers. Thank you all so much. That also answers one of our other questions from Paige, who was asking availabilities for opportunities for someone in high school. Like you said, your program is open for 16-year-olds, and our museum, we have high school volunteers too. Again, it's about reaching out and just asking. There are a lot of ways out there, and there are even some internships for high school students to work in places. This next question, I just lost it. Where did it go? Oh, this next question, it comes from Michael Partham, who's asking, have you ended up breaking a specimen while preparing it, and how often does that happen?
Laura, you want to go first? One of the common sayings is you're not a paleontologist until you break a fossil. Yeah, it happens all the time. That's what glue is for. Fossils are going to break. They want to break. It's like they want to die a second time, and we're trying to bring them back. I don't know what else to say to that. Yeah, frequently. Laura?
Frequently, but not all the time. And especially as we develop more familiarity, and that's one of the things that is a benefit to having long-term experience with particular types of material. Like when Jared was saying earlier, where he came from Hell Creek and moved into a different formation, I was like, all right, new skill set, new sediment, who dis? And even at the Tarpits, from like one deposit to another, one area of a deposit to another, it's completely different sediment types. And every once in a while, when you come across a new sediment type, like there was one particular sediment type in one of the deposits a couple years ago that I just referred to in my field notes as the Matrix of Tears, because those fossils I normally don't have to use glue outside because our fossils are pretty stable, but I had to use glue outside, and I got to the point where one time I just put my head down and started to cry because I was trying so desperately to help this one particular fossil. And one of my coworkers had to be like, do you want to go inside because you're on public view right now? And I was like, that's probably the responsible professional thing to do. So statistically speaking, not very often across, the tens of thousands of fossils I've worked on. But every once in a while, yes, absolutely. And the thing that improves is the ability to break things well. It's definitely one of those where sometimes if a volunteer has something that's very tricky, I'll come in and be like, it's not that I don't trust you, but I know how to come at it, that even if I do break it, it'll be an easier fix for the lab team inside to repair. The type of break will kind of like Cinderella slipper back together and be able to be more stable, because I know how to break it well if it is going to break. And sometimes it doesn't break and they're like, oh, I thought it was going to break. And you're like, no, I'm just that amazing. But sometimes it does. So a lot of it is, again, just that experience and working on doing fewer damages overall, but also easier to repair damages overall.
Yes, and if I can follow in on Laura's controlled breakage approach, it is an occupational hazard. And the reality is actually that the safest place for a fossil is in the ground. But there are instances, like in the lab as well, where you just can't prevent damage sometimes. For example, if a saber-toothed canine has a crack going through it and we are using a liquid solvent to break down the oil in the asphalt, that can seep through the crack and it can disassociate that one portion of the canine to the other. The most important thing to do whenever a specimen breaks is to immediately take control of the situation. Document what's happened, take photographs, put it to one side, make sure it doesn't get contaminated with anything else in the space, and then repair it as soon as possible before little bits and pieces go missing. So it's often more the response to breakage that's important than actually worrying too much about if you are going to break something.
Yeah, just kind of adding on to what everyone else was saying. It doesn't happen, every single day, but it does happen. And it's a pretty common occupational hazard. I once broke a piece of like a turtle shell off by breathing on it too hard. And it was just a little piece. And I don't even really remember like breathing that hard, but I was just kind of breathing through my nose and I was looking down on it and all of a sudden one just fell off and of course, that tiny little piece, of course, with my brain, I had to immediately just glue it back on there because I knew I would lose it if I didn't. And so, yeah, it happens. And if anybody tells you otherwise, they're lying.
That's very true. I almost quit because I broke a sloth scapula into a million pieces. I was picking it up and moving it to a jacket, and my curator at the time was like, "Are you sure you want to do that?" And I was like, "Yeah." And as soon as I hesitated, the whole thing just shattered in my hand, and she's all like, "This is called glue. Time for you to learn how to use it." I was like, "Okay." But it was a good learning experience. But I didn't quit either. Yeah, so yeah, like Jared said, sometimes you're not a paleontologist until you break that fossil. So pick it up, glue it all together, and you're fine. Here's a question specifically for Stephany that I want to get to before I lose it. This is from Allison Park, who's asking, do you have a recommendation for a museum or a place to volunteer or get a foot in the door in South Africa?
Yeah, you can try any of your museums depending on which province or city you're in South Africa. But the one where I started was the Ditsong National Museum of Natural History in Pretoria. But you can also try universities. The University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg has a phenomenal paleontology department. They're actually a center of excellence. And they've also got University of Johannesburg. You've got Iziko Museum in Cape Town. You've got Bloemfontein Museum in the Free State. There's a lot of places. Like we've been saying over and over again, reach out to any museum or university institution close to you and find out if they are taking volunteers. And sometimes it might not be that they are actively recruiting volunteers to work year-round in a lab, but they might need people to help out in the field. And that's an absolutely awesome way to get experience as well, is to go out on digs and be part of the dig team.
Thank you for that. This question comes from username Majraj, who is asking, who among you started collecting as a kid or an amateur paleontologist? Do you think the shrinking window for amateur collection affects the formation and recruitment of tomorrow's techs and scholars?
So I definitely had my ammonites and brachiopods as a kid, but it was definitely one of those that my bias is that I, again, was partially raised by an archaeologist who was very into data collection and the sustainability of collections in places that were accessible to research, because science is about being able to reproduce things. And that's part of the reason why things held in institutions is very important. I'm not saying I don't still have the occasional ammonite and brachiopod, but at the same time, I definitely had a respect early for making sure that things were safe in like a library of fossils that everyone could share, rather than just a beautiful thing that I have. Because if I have a beautiful thing, I have a beautiful thing. But if I have a beautiful thing in a place that I can share it with everyone else potentially, me personally, I have my bias towards that. And again, I work in museums, so that's my bias. But it's definitely one of those that I haven't necessarily noticed, because again, I do a lot of outreach as well. I work in the middle of Los Angeles. I'm in mid-city. There's a fence between me and the public, but all of the excavating I do, like I'll like pause, look up, and answer questions. And I've noticed that I don't seem to notice kids, like there are kids who are like, I have fossils, but they don't seem to have any particular like stronger lean towards being excited about fossils, that those that don't mention that they have fossils at home. Like, I think that getting a chance to work with things that aren't around anymore, or telling the stories of the things in the past, is something that doesn't have to be tactile always to still have that same level of enthusiasm. So I have, aspirations, but at the same time, our technology is getting so good where, you have some kids who have AR and VR that they can interact with fossils in ways that I didn't even have the opportunity to do. So I'm optimistic, and I'll wait and see what technology brings us.
All right. Well, that's coming up to the end of our panel. Thank you all so much for those great answers. We're going to end today with one last question, an advice, I guess, question for everybody is, what is one skill that you think is underrated that you would suggest people learn to get into paleontological preparation?
Puzzle building. Puzzle building is a skill that I transfer into the lab regularly. We actually even have a puzzle in the back for volunteers to work on. It's useful for identifying little things, seeing how little things match up, and also how to fit pieces together. So it has a multifaceted influence in the lab. And then also, like I said, we refer to our conservation or adhesive station as our arts and crafts station. We use kozo paper, which is a Japanese, very thin paper that's made out of mulberry fibers that we use to bridge or strengthen bone with the adhesive. And it's very much like paper mache work that we do. So there's a lot of arts and crafts skill sets. When people apply to be a volunteer, we often look at people that have an arts and crafts skill set, actually even sometimes above someone that has a formal degree in paleontology, because those skill sets are extremely useful in the lab space. And then anything with dexterity, if you're playing guitars or you knit or crochet, those are also very valuable things to keep doing, and keeping all those little neurons firing to keep enhancing those skill sets, because they all have some purpose in the lab and then get utilized to some degree.
I'm not sure if asking questions counts as a skill, but it's something that I would say definitely needs practice sometimes. So we're going to go with it. But as Stephany mentioned earlier, the Association for Materials and Methods in Paleontology is one of many great resources. And it's also one of a few awesome societies where you can ask questions. We're all going to be working on specimens that haven't seen the light of day for, sometimes many millions of years. And you're not the first one to do that. And other people have had the problems that you're having. For instance, I'm trying to figure out a new technique. And instead of wasting my time hitting my head against a wall and failing over and over again, I just asked the person who invented the technique, and I emailed her. And that saved me so much time. It's part asking questions, but it's also kind of, in a way, like getting over yourself. And it's okay to understand that you don't know everything, and that it's okay to ask questions. And always reach out for help. Never be afraid to do that.
Yeah, this kind of goes along the line of Jared's a little bit. What I was going to say is, it's not really a skill, but more like get out of your comfort zone. Because I used to have this awful fear of public speaking, And during my undergrad, of course, a lot of my professors asked us to get up in front of the class and present our research topic, and it would just paralyze me. But with practice and just patience with myself, I learned to more or less get over that, I guess. I'm not completely over it, but the thing is, like, get out of your comfort zone. If you're not sure of something, you know, like Jared said, just ask questions and don't be afraid to just ask somebody, and don't be afraid to be wrong, because you're not going to be right 100% of the time. So it's just kind of, like Jared said, you know, getting over yourself and just kind of throwing away that fear that you could be wrong or that you could mess something up. So just kind of get out of your comfort zone a little bit, and just don't be afraid to try new things or things that you're unsure of.
And just to kind of echo everything that everyone was saying, like, those were all things that I was going to mention as well. Like, acknowledging that it's okay to not know something is, I feel like, I do agree that it's a skill, because it's one of those things that we're told for so long, like, well, if you don't know the answer, then you just make something up. And, like, the field of science, like, science is just a tool. Like, it's designed to ask questions. That is the main part of what science is asking questions. So feeling that freedom to say, hey, I don't know, I'm going to ask, or I forgot, I'm going to ask, or I want a different viewpoint on this. Let me go talk with someone else. So communication also then comes into that, because, like, it's always the people whoever says that they know everything, I will always give side eye to, because it's one of those things that it's impossible. It's literally impossible. It's the only reason I could possibly ever want to become a vampire, because then it gives me the hundreds of years to try to learn everything, but you can't. It's impossible. There's too much. So really having that freedom to say, I don't know, but let's see if we can find out, is something that I really do think is a skill. And then also, like, feeling free to pipe up and say, well, I mean, I don't know if this is related, but we're building this exhibit case and we're trying to get the fabric to sit right. I used to help my mom recover our dining room furniture. I think I might be able to help with this. And yes, I was, for the record. But it was one of those things where you never know what skill sets are going to translate. So having that freedom to be like, hey, I think I might be able to help, even though I didn't have a degree in this particular subject, I may still be able to do this. So you're awesome. Just let everyone else know it. But also know that everyone else is potentially awesome too, and they might have something to say.
Everybody's awesome, especially everyone on this panel today. Well, that does it for our panel and for our Path of the Paleontologist virtual event. This has been really, really amazing. I want to say thank you to all of our amazing guests here and on all the other panels. And we hope that the Discovery Day Online, Path of the Paleontologist, and the Alf Museum were able to help so many of you today kind of figure out how to do your path of the paleontologist. I think the thing we all learned today is that there is no one path, and the path is yours to make. And if you need help along the way, there are a lot of amazing people out there who are willing to help you find that path for you. All of the preparators here, all of our keepers, collections managers, curators, and the students, reach out to them. You've met them. You see that we're all normal, mostly normal people who are willing to, mostly normal. We all know that, who are willing to help out. So yeah, we hope we were able to help all of you today. So to end things, just want to say thank you to all of our amazing audience for sticking through our 4 panels. If you want to meet more paleontologists, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We have Fossil Friday chats every Friday. We have many more events coming. Find us online at the Alf Museum. And like I said, send an email. We're happy to answer that. That does it for all of us today on Path of the Paleontologist. I'm going to go get some boba. I hope you all have a great rest of your weekend, and hopefully we'll see you all at the museum soon. Bye, everybody.